Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Welcome back, adventurers. Today we're going to be talking about the classes, but specifically as it pertains to newer players. And yes, today is a tier list. So when I talk about pertaining to new players, what I mean is we're not going to talk about how powerful they are or what you can do with them, perhaps, how good they are in a specific area of play, whether that be combat or social or exploration. No, we're going to talk about how easy it is for a new player coming into Pathfinder 2nd Edition to be able to pick it up and run with it. This could be for different reasons. It could be because they only rely on less complex rules, or there are fewer options. Today we're going to look at all of this based on the currently released classes and rank them on just how easy they are to play. So we'll be rating them on a scale from S to D. S being a class that is very simple, basic understanding of the game. You know the 3-action economy, you understand movement and basic strikes and things like that. And there's minimal class-specific detail you have to pick up here. D being only meant for those players that are really sufficiently into the game, who want to learn more complex play styles. It'll maybe provide you more options, but it does require you to get a little deeper. So not usually something I recommend for somebody coming right into the game, but more those who've been playing for a bit and want to dive into something very, very interesting and challenging to grasp. So we're going to do this in alphabetical order, which means we are going to kick off with the Alchemist. The Alchemist is a very interesting class. It got updated in Player Core 2 Remaster, which is exciting because I think it made the class both slightly easier to use and also far more interesting to play. This is a martial in a way. It's a bit of an off martial, what people might call a partial or half martial, and that's because its primary ability score is not dexterity or strength. Instead, it is intelligence. So some pros as far as new players come is that it's a very fun playstyle and you can keep it simple. The subclasses provide a good amount of fantasy to them, and some of them can be straightforward to play. If you're playing a bomber, you throw bombs. If you really want to just focus on throwing bombs, it can be relatively simple compared to some of the other playstyles to just huck bombs constantly. And because you are a martial class, you don't have spell casting you need to worry about, which does add a lot of challenge, and you'll see that throughout the tier list. Spellcasters will never get above B rank just because spell casting is complicated to learn. Now, some challenges here is that you're forced to learn and play using alchemical items, which means you have to look through a lot of different items, understand how they're going to work in gameplay. You're going to have to decide how many you want to make of these, both beginning of the day because there's some features there, and also just generally speaking, right? If you want to craft them using crafting, not related to your class features. There are some class keywords that are specific to alchemists that you do have to worry about. This has to do with things that you're mixing in later on. There are some features here that are a little bit confusing, I think, for some new players, things like advanced alchemy, and that being separate from versatile vials. There's a lot of the things that are very specific to alchemists that require a lot of understanding of both how the game works, but a niche type of play in the game. Being intelligence-based martial, it is maybe a little confusing to understand how your plus to hit works. Class DC, which does play a big role here, versus your just attack rolls and regular AC and things like that. So a little bit there, but that's not too bad. And the last thing is each subclass does take a different understanding of the rules. A bomber who's just hucking bombs at enemies all day is going to play very different from a mutagenist. Great if you're looking for a more complex play style and you want to dive into how can I play all the different versions of an alchemist, but difficult for somebody coming in. So we're going to give them a C rating. Next on our list is the Barbarian. This is a full martial class. You want to run in, get angry, and hit hard, making this pretty easy to play. There was a little bit more challenge before the remaster in Player Core 2, but I would say it's actually gotten a little bit easier over time. So again, martial class, strength-based, using martial weapons, not a lot to learn there. Very few mechanics. Really, it's rage. Rage as a mechanic is the only thing you need to learn, and that's even gotten a little less complex as they removed a penalty with it. There's learning about using, while you're in a rage, you can't use concentrate actions, but that's just having to learn to look for a certain tag. So it's pretty straightforward and doesn't require more than just running up and swinging if you really want to. Obviously, it can be more complex than that, but you can play it with just that in mind. You'll feel good because you're able to hit hard without having to worry about too many different things. These subclasses, while they do have different fantasy to them and occasionally a feat here or there that helps them play a little different from each other, they will play pretty much the same as each other. So you don't have to worry about sliding too far in the complexity realm just because you want to try out different subclasses. Now there are a little bit of complexities here and there, especially around giant. What does it mean to use a giant weapon? How does that work? How can I get them? That can be a little bit of a challenge. And then there are the anathemas. So this has changed a lot with Player Core 2, but the anathemas, if you have one, which not many do, it just means that there's a potential issue you have to deal with where you could lose your barbarian-specific abilities if you do something against your anathema. Pretty easy to handle that, both to learn them and avoid those things, but also for a GM to maybe give you a little bit of a pass, especially early on. I'm considering Barbarian S for how simple it is to play. All right, next up is the Bard. The Bard has a fairly simple loop, but we are talking about a full spellcaster here. Bard is special in that they have a whole lot of cantrips that they can keep going. These are cantrips that they cast using, well, because of the cantrip you don't actually use them, but they're part of the focus spell pool, even though you don't have to use a focus spell to cast a cantrip, but you do have to cast them every turn or sustain them, and the action economy around that can be a little challenging for new players to learn. Add on top of that you of course are a full spellcaster, and there's enough there that it is, I'd say, a little more than you might want to bite off as a first character. Having said that, once you do understand the loop, once you do understand how to keep your special cantrips running, your composition cantrips, and how the other composition spells work, it's actually one of the simpler spellcasters, I would say, and you can even feel like you can get up in people's faces, do some martial attacks if you want to simplify some of your actions a bit. So as spellcasters go, I consider them a little easier than some, and that's why I'm going to give them a B on complexity. All right, let's dive into the Champion. The Champion is a martial class. For those of you coming from D&D 5e, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Champions don't have spellcasting, with the exception of they can learn some focus spells. But you don't even have to do that if you don't want to. At least you don't have to go deep down that well. You can just leave it very simple. So you're a martial class, meaning avoiding spellcasting, meaning you're going up, you're trying to hit people, defending at the front line. You are generally the bulkiest character on the playfield. So while you do have different subclasses that all play slightly different from each other, they kind of share this I want to be on the front lines mentality. Outside of the subclasses, which again, similar in play, they just offer you, generally speaking, different reactions to use, so that doesn't change your playstyle a lot. The rest of the kit is pretty straightforward and easy to understand. However, you have to learn a few special things. One of them is, yes, you're going to have to learn focus spells a bit, so a little harder than a lot of other martials who won't have any of that. Next, you have to understand sanctification. So they got rid of alignment when they did the remaster, but you can still sanctify to be either holy or unholy, and this does play into the class. Certain subclasses may require you to sanctify. There are certain deities you can be related to that may require or offer you sanctification. You have to understand, is that going to help me? Is it going to hurt me? So there is a bit to understand about that whole system that can be a little confusing. And as I kind of alluded to, not only do you have to learn sanctification, potentially, but you have to understand the deities. And there are a lot. there's a lot of deities in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and they all have special quirks about them. You may have to figure out what fits you best, and that might take a lot of reading if you don't want to just randomly choose, and you may not want to just randomly choose. And finally, they do have Anathema. Now, we talked about that with Barbarian. Anathema, not a huge challenge, can usually be pretty easy to work around, but you probably do have to dive in and make sure that you're not making mistakes that lose you all of your champion abilities. So with Champion, even though it's a martial, it's also going to receive a B. All right, Cleric, your go-to healing class. So Cleric is a full spellcaster. Just put that right out there. Means automatically we have challenges, a lot of spells to learn, have to understand how spells work. They're a prepared caster. For more on that, I'll have a video that you can watch about spellcasting and breaking down how it works, but that's just one of the styles of spellcaster. There are challenges to understanding how it works, however. Now, a few pros here. While they have a lot of spellcasting to worry about, they get a special type, which is their font, which can be either healing or harm. This is actually pretty easy to understand. You're going to get a certain number of uses, 4 to start out, of the heal or harm spell per day that you can just use. Doesn't use spell slots, no worry about refocusing, it's not a focus point thing, you just get them. Hooray, they level up with you, very good and very easy to understand. The spell, once you read it once, you'll understand how it works, and there won't be much challenge there. Also, you can just, if you want to, focus on healing. That could be your whole thing you do. If you want to be a great healer, you can kind of reduce down the challenge of this. Movement and healing can get you a long way, and again, for those coming from D&D, in Pathfinder, healing is very critical. Not just waiting till people go down, there's good reasons for that, but you do actually want to heal your allies in this game. So, along with the challenges of having to learn all the spell casting, you do have to also learn Sanctification with Cleric. Now, you can avoid Sanctification just like you can with Champion, but if you want to play into this holy or unholy war system, you may have to learn Sanctification, and once again, you have to learn deities. And even more so than the Champion, the deities here affect what you have available to you. So there's quite a bit to learn, and there are major differences between the two subclasses, only 2, but there are major differences between them with the Cleric. The Cloistered Cleric is a full caster. You're going to be sitting back, you don't want to be up in the fray, whereas the War Priest, better armor, martial weapons, you're getting up there with your other martials, doing damage while healing and casting your spells, because you still have all your spell casting. There's a big difference there in how they play. So I would say as far as spellcasters go, while it's certainly not the most challenging spellcaster, I actually think this one is more challenging than something like the Bard and a few others we're going to see later. I would call this a C. Druids, your nature spellcaster. Alright, so Druids are actually one of the more straightforward spellcasters. You can build yourself to be just a simple healing or damage dealing spellcaster. That is straightforward. There are subclasses to support either of those where you don't have to go down a more challenging route. Having said that, there are some special things that only Druids do. Some of the subclasses play completely differently. The Untamed, for instance, will have you polymorphing a lot, and there's a lot of rules to read there. You might get confused about how all that works or may not want to go that deep. Other subclasses have either animal companions or familiars, and there's a lot of rules around both of those. So there is complexity you can have with your Druid, but you don't have to. Finally, they do have Anathema, similar to some of the other classes we've talked about. These Anathema are, again, usually pretty easy to avoid, but something you do need to understand to make sure you aren't making choices that lose you all of your Druid abilities for a certain amount of time. But as spellcasters go, you can make them less complex, so I think as beginners, this would be a B. Fighter. This is your prototypical baseline martial. That doesn't mean weak. In fact, there's many people who would argue that they're overpowered. They're an extremely strong class. They are strong because they have the highest chance to critically strike a foe with their general strikes, depending on which route you go, which makes them very fun to play for new players. They are a high damage class. They don't have much to learn in their subclasses, which they don't actually have, and we'll talk about that in a second, or with their traits. There's just a couple keywords you need to learn. So when I say subclasses, most classes have them. Fighter does not. Monk does not. We'll get to that later. It's a build your own style. Do you want to be great at bows? Great, there's feats for that. Do you want to be great with a two-handed weapon? Great, there's feats for that. Do you want to be punching people in the face? There's feats for that. You want to tackle people to the ground? There's feats for that. The fighter can go any which way you want to go. That doesn't actually make them hard to learn. It makes them actually easy to learn because you just focus on the feats that help you most. And it's very simple to find a rhythm in combat that fits your style. So the only real downside here is you need to learn a few keywords like flourish, press, and potentially stance. But these don't take much. All of them are very easy to understand. So I consider fighter an S. On to the Gunslinger, one of the uncommon classes, so make sure that you're allowed to use it. Check with your GM. This is another martial class, and it has a very simple rhythm to its combat. Some would say that you're actually locked into too tight a rhythm, but I think it can be great for new players, as you have a pretty consistent actions you're doing within combat. These subclasses play slightly differently, but you're still wielding a gun no matter how you're doing it, and you can keep a very similar rhythm no matter what. So it's just what kind of gun you want to use, and what abilities might be able to play along with that. Also, what you get to do is you reload. Every subclass for Gunslinger reloads in a different way, where you get to reload while doing something else. That's most of what you're learning. So on the con side, there's a few things you need to learn. So you have to understand the misfire trait, which has a little bit of complexity, words. But you also have to learn certain skills, because some of what you do in combat does rely on, or at least relate to, certain skills, generally charisma skills, or potentially stealth. So a reload action for a certain subclass might have you demoralize while you reload, or create a distraction while you reload. So you'll have to understand those things to be able to optimally play your subclass, but you can stick with easier subclasses if you don't want to have to worry about learning those things. And finally, there's just general gun operation, which isn't to say much. You have to understand how reload works, and you may want to learn certain weapon traits like scatter, but you can avoid that pretty easily. So I consider Gunslinger to be an A rank for new players. All right, next is the Inventor. This is another martial class, and it has a certain rhythm to it that's you can create. You don't have to go complex if you don't want to here. There are two subclasses of the three that are pretty similar to each other, the third requiring a little more of you. While there isn't a lot in their general play that you have to worry about, you can use, there are some cons here. So you may have to use crafting as a focus, which means you have to learn how crafting works. It's potentially avoidable for you, but you're going to gain it as you go and encouraged to use it. You'll also need to learn how to use companions if you want to use their third subclass, which relates to you having a little robot buddy. That is your whole focus of your subclass. There are some class-specific traits to learn, things like gadget, modification, unstable probably being one of the more interesting ones. And you have a key class feature called overdrive that plays into this as well. So you've got a lot of things in your head all at once that you do have to keep track of. So even though it's a martial, it's actually a little more difficult to learn than I'd say several spellcasters, and that's why I'm giving Inventor a C. All right, next is Investigator. So the Investigator is another martial class, so no spells to learn, which is great. And there's another way to make this class easy to have a rhythm in combat. There are certain actions you're going to play, and they've simplified it even more, I would say, with the remaster from Player Core 2. You've got some class skills, and learning them is definitely challenging, but once you've learned them, you can use them in a cycle in combat to gain advantage against enemies. And even though you are what we call a partial martial or half martial, because you don't have dex or strength as your key ability score, it is actually intelligence in this case, much like we saw earlier with the Alchemist. You can use you can use intelligence to make your attack rolls in certain cases. So that's great, and there's no special traits to learn on your feats, which is also a win. But where does the challenge come in? Okay, so the challenge comes in your core class abilities, specifically Pursue a Lead and Devise a Stratagem. These are lengthy, they require GM fiat sometimes, there's a lot of interaction with the GM, you're going to be having to determine what it is you're pursuing a lead on. This can be very general, especially now where it's like this larger question. You have to figure out whether enemies you've encountered or situations you're in relate to that lead, and that provides changes in how Devise a Stratagem works. Devise a Stratagem being a way to roll a d20 ahead of time and know kind of how your outcomes are going to go for your next strike. So there is a lot to learn with the class, making it one of the more challenging martial classes, not as difficult as Inventor in my mind, but it is challenging and does lean pretty heavily into the creativity side, so maybe not ideal for somebody who's new to TTRPGs in general. I consider this a B. Kineticist. Kineticist isn't really martial, isn't really a spellcaster. It lives somewhere in between. Your feats, your abilities that you have, act like spells, but there's no spell slots, so there's not as much spell casting to have to learn, which is great. And some of your features do work a lot like martial abilities, which is also really useful. And you can just kind of keep doing them turn after turn. You don't have to learn weapons, which is nice, but that's kind of the end of the pros here for somebody just coming into the system. So what are the challenges? Oh boy, there are so many special rules, terms, features you have to learn. First, the options are enormous. It's a build your own subclass, but there's more definition to it, and it can be very challenging to do. Even from level 1, choosing whether you're going to go with a single gate or 2 gates, learning what gates are, what the effect that has on your play style, what you can choose when you've got those different gates, what buffs you get for a single gate versus 2 gates. There is a lot to go through here. There's a reason that it takes so many pages to build out this class. It is one of the most complex classes in the game. Very rewarding to play, a lot of fun, but I do not recommend it for new players. I think it's a lot to get your head around. I consider this a D when it comes to entering the game. Right, and on to the Magus. So the Magus is an interesting class. It is both a martial and a spellcaster by default. It's a martial. It relies on either strength or dexterity for its key ability score, but you need high intelligence because you're also a spellcaster, an arcane spellcaster at that. So while you have some ability to just go up and attack if you want to take advantage of what the class does, you're going to need to understand spellcasting. You've got cantrips, you've got focus spells, you've got spells that rely on spell slots, and at the same time, you have to understand how the focus spells affect your stance that you can go into that allows you to use Spell Strike, which is your main ability you get for being a Magus. You have to understand what spells you can cast into your weapon when you Spell Strike. There's a lot of challenges in playing the class in an effective way that actually makes it fun. There's a lot of challenge to come with it, actually working out, understanding how often you can Spell Strike, when you can and can't. Because of all of that, because of the complexity of just your every turn flow, I would consider Magus to be a D for new players. All right, and on to the Monk. The Monk is a full martial and, like the Fighter, doesn't have subclasses. It's a build-your-own class design. This one's a little more specific because a lot of what you would start out with are stances. So you will have to learn stances. It's not very hard to learn, but it is something to learn. But as soon as you're in a stance, then there are certain special types of unarmed strikes you get to make. Besides learning those special unarmed strikes, you simply learn Flurry of Blows. Flurry of Blows is one of the simplest class-specific features to learn. You get to make 2 strikes for 1 action. It follows the normal penalty for strikes, so you're still going to get a -5 or -4 as you're likely doing an agile strike on your second hit. Other than that, there's not much else to learn. And you don't even have to learn weapons, don't have to go through a list of weapons if you're using unarmed strikes. There is a version where you can rely heavily on key spells, which are a type of focus spell, but you can avoid that entirely. So if you want a little bit more, you want some focus spells in there, if you want to be Goku, you can go that route. Or you can play a monk using your fists, and it's very straightforward to play. I consider monks to be an S rank for new players. All right, into the Oracle. So I first want to call out that the Oracle got a major overhaul with Player Core 2. And in my mind, that's a very good thing. The Oracle used to be, hands down, without question, the most complex class to learn. In fact, I have watched videos by many fellow YouTubers who struggled themselves to convey it or even possibly understand parts of it because there was so much built into how it worked. This benefit and penalty system, how it leveled up as you went, what effects they'd have on you and your ability to use your focus spells and your class feats. So it's still complicated, and this is still a full caster. You still have all the types of spells that you would find on other full casters. The added challenge to the Oracle is the system that they've got around being curse bound. This is a trait you're going to have to learn, and it affects the level of the curse you have on you, which is a detriment you take, and it's specific to the subclass you chose. And then there are feats you take to increase the curse bound, and refocusing decreases it, and you have to learn curse bound, fortune, misfortune. There's a lot to read with some of the feats and understand when it all applies and how, and when it increases your curse bound, and they're very complex. They've reduced the complexity quite a bit. This would otherwise have been on a tier all on its own. I would have had to add F in here, but thankfully, with the remaster, it's still just a D. And speaking of those that I consider a D for new players, let's move on to the Psychic. Here is yet another full caster, so all the spellcasting stuff you need to learn. This is more of a cantrip caster, though. So while you can build a system where you just rely on those cantrips, which are usually a little bit better than the cantrips others get, you only get a specific set for your subclass, but you get these and they're a little bit juiced up compared to others. You can just rely on those if you want to. Great. However, if you're really going to use what this class has available to it, there's a lot to learn here. So outside of the class, the spellcasting for the class, you get specific mechanics, things like Amp, Psi cantrips, Unleash Psyche, and the Mind Shift trait. We're not going to dive into any of that here. I'll have a video about Psychics where we will cover all of those. Those are all very specific just to this class, and the effect that they have on your spellcasting varies wildly. So not only that, your subclass is also a challenge onto its own because it's two-part. You get a conscious mind and a unconscious mind, and these affect what cantrips you get to start with, what amps you have, what your Unleashed Psyche looks like. It's a lot to learn for anybody new to this system. Even outside of that, the feats you get often provide other amps that you can then swap with the amps that are natural to your cantrips, and heightening is different, and oh boy, there's a lot to learn here. Much like the Oracle, this is definitely a D for new players. All right, on to the Ranger. The Ranger, and I'm going to call this out for those who are coming over from D&D 5e, the Ranger in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is not a spellcaster. You can take some focus spells, so it's not that you can't have any casting at all, but you don't have to. You can avoid that entirely. You are not a spellcaster by default. You are a martial character, and you can just stick that way pretty easily. The gameplay loop is very straightforward. You can be at range, you can be up in melee, wielding two weapons. You've got martials, you can use a bow, you can use guns. Lots of ways to play a ranger. All of them are pretty simple to play. Two of the three subclasses are very similar to each other. One just is about hitting harder on a single shot. One's about being able to attack lots of times in the same turn. The third one does add a little challenge to it versus the first two, but still, it's easy to choose a subclass that makes this very simple to play. As far as class-specific mechanics go, there's really only one, and it's about your hunt prey. So as soon as you learn hunt prey, which isn't very challenging, you're in a pretty good place. Again, on the con side, there are focus spells. If you choose to grab them, you'll add a little complexity onto yourself. And you can choose to have an animal companion if you wish. That will add some complexity as well. But again, you're kind of choosing that for yourself. You don't have to have any of that. So you can make it a little more complex, but by default, if you want to play a ranger and you want it to be straightforward, it can be. I consider rangers an S for new players. Rogue. Rogues are yet another martial, and these are your sneaky, stealthy, sneak attackers. They're a martial class, which means no spell casting by default. In fact, they don't have any ability to get spells for their class itself, so you don't even have to worry about what you would for a ranger necessarily. Your subclasses play fairly similar to each other. There is definitely some difference, so they're not all identical, but you can play the same type of rogue if you want to, no matter which direction you go, even though there's a lot of difference in some of the abilities they have access to. You don't have to play into those specifically. Now, with that though, your primary ability for this isn't necessarily dexterity. While dexterity is, I'd call, the default for a rogue, you can choose any except for constitution, which can be a lot of complexity potentially for somebody coming in, and it may be hard for them to know why they would choose a different one. So if you want to stick just with dexterity, that'll make it very simple. Otherwise, the thing you have to learn is how to make enemies off guard. So the sneak attack, which is really that defining feature for rogues, that sneak attack damage only applies when you hit a character that's off guard to you. And there's a ton of ways to make off guard happen, but you do need to learn how off guard works and how best to get it applied. Not overly complex, but a little bit to learn. And finally, there are debilitations as part of this class. You'll get debilitating strike. This applies certain effects to creatures, so there's definitely some things to learn there, but you could potentially avoid that entirely if you want to. I consider Rogue to be an A for new players. We're getting to the end here. All right, on to the Sorcerer. The Sorcerer is a full caster, but I would consider it almost the most straightforward full caster. So while you do have to learn all the spells, you get your subclass choices play pretty much the same. They really just give you access to a few different spells that you'll get by default, and they give you some different focus spells. But it's not so crazy that there's like a whole different class to learn because you chose a different subclass. And there's no specific abilities or traits to learn. I would say the most complex part, aside from the spells themselves, is to understand that, hey, depending on what subclass I choose, I'm going to get a different spell list. But that's really not that much complexity, so as spellcasters go, pretty easy for new players. And also, they're just, if you want to play a high damage caster, this is a very simple way to go. I would say that sorcerers are a B for new players. All right, the Summoner. The Summoner is another caster. We're going to see a lot of that as we end this video. Another caster, lots of spells to learn. Obviously, this is another case where you will have different spell schools depending on what subclass you go with. The different subclasses, though, do play pretty similar to each other, so you don't have to worry about, understanding a whole different style of play because you chose a different subclass, which is good because the class itself is very complex. So when you play a Summoner, you have yourself to worry about and another creature to worry about. But unlike an animal companion, you have to share your actions in a different way. And just learning how to use the actions, especially things like the tandem actions, can be a lot to learn. There are evolutions, which is a type of focus spell that you can push onto your Eidolon, which is what your companion is called. You have to learn about the Eidolon as they gain abilities themselves, and you can upgrade them in different ways that are beyond what a normal companion would have. And you're kind of in this spellcaster plus martial combo where you share health between the two of you, but you're split on the battlefield. There's a lot to control, a lot to stay aware of, a lot of understanding how different effects might hit both of you or just one of you or only count once. And it's a lot for one person to manage who's new to this system. So I consider Summoner, along with Psychic and Oracle, to be a D. All right, on to the Swashbuckler. Swashbuckler is another class that got overhauled in Player Core 2, and I like that a lot because it helped make them a little easier to play, in my opinion. They are a martial class. Their gameplay loop is pretty easy. The subclasses play similar to each other with usually just one little thing you have to learn. It's basically one type of skill-related ability or action that has an effect on your main class feature, which is Panache. And other than that, you're just there to get in and out, make some attacks, and use what are called finishers. So as far as class-specific traits and features, you have Panache, which is the way that you kind of buff yourself up, and finishers, which uses Panache to deal extra damage or do extra things when you attack. Other than learning Panache and finishers, there's not really a lot to learn. I did mention the skills you need to understand, so depending on what subclass, maybe you have to learn Demoralize or Feint, and you're going to want to learn Tumble Through, because they can all use that. So there are some skill actions, which adds a little more complexity than something like Barbarian or Fighter. And other than that, yeah, Panache is very easy to get now. I would have said it was challenging before. You do have to learn the Bravado trait now, but that's really just to say when you use this, class feat that has Bravado, you get Panache, which is pretty easy to learn. So I still consider this to be an A rank for new players. All right, on to the Thaumaturge, another martial class before we end out with a couple of spellcasters. This can be either ranged or melee. This, however, is also a build your own subclass, but in a little different way. You're going to build a subclass of 3 objects out of a total of 9. You can build a pretty easy loop here between recalling knowledge, which you're going to need to do using something specific to the class called esoteric lore, and just attacking. So while you can have it pretty simple in that way, you have to understand how the esoterica, these items I talked about, the implements, which is what I talked about, play into your loop. Some giving you actions, some reactions, some are just base effects, and you are going to have to rely on a skill. You have to rely on your esoteric lore. And why you have to rely on it is the only way to get the most value out of this class is to find the weaknesses of your enemies, or even give them one, and exploit it when you hit them. So you have to learn things like esoterica, implements, exploit vulnerability. There are definitely quite a few class features you need to learn to play this well. It is not a simple martial. There are definitely more challenging classes, but I still consider Thaumaturge to be a C for new players. At least you don't have to learn spellcasting. All right, the Witch, another full caster here, an intelligence-based full caster. This one has a variety of subclasses, and you can have a pretty simple flow if you want to, just casting cantrips and using your core feature, which is sustaining a hex. Hexes themselves do take a lot to understand, and especially how it relates to your subclass and what it means for your familiar, which gets us onto the con. Every witch has a familiar, and where the familiar is and how it acts in combat needs to interact well with your hex cantrips that you get, which are your focus spells for your subclass. There is a lot there. Outside of that familiar, though, and how you upgrade familiars and how you use them, this is actually not that much harder than something like a bard to play, in my opinion. It is harder, but I'd say it actually only falls into the C category. And I do think that maybe not ideal as your first class, but it's not as bad as it could be. And finally, the Wizard. Yes, we've made it through all of these classes, which is exciting, assuming I could get this out before October when 2 new classes join, but if not, those will be in here too. The Wizard is, generally speaking, a pretty straightforward spellcaster. This is an arcane spellcaster, so you have to learn the spell list, and you have to be able to figure out how to put them into your spell book, but beyond that, you're really just relying on those known spells, which you get to cast more of them per day than other classes get out of their prepared list, which is nice. And you can use them to just be a blaster, or you could, control the battlefield. You can focus on what you like. So not a lot of class-specific mechanics to learn. You don't even rely heavily on your focus spells, I would say, as a wizard. You can, of course, you will have focus spells, but you don't have to rely on them. I'd say the only real challenge for this versus something like a druid is that your subclass really has 2 parts to it. So you have to learn both a thesis and a school. Not really that much once you read through them. It doesn't have a huge effect on how you play, and they'll all play similar enough to each other that there's not a lot to understand there. So it's really more just the fact that they're a full spellcaster. I'm going to give them a B. All right, and there we go. Do you agree or disagree with these ratings? Put your thoughts in the comments below. I hope this helps you try to figure out your first class or one of your players' first classes if you're a GM coming here. If you are looking for deeper dives into these classes, stay tuned. I'm going to get to the classes. There are great content creators out there if you want to go through every feat that exists within class. I will try to help new players get into using a class in a very simple way. So, yep, watch for that. Please do subscribe and like this video if you can. I really appreciate it. There are so many great content creators out there, though. Please go check out more Pathfinder 2nd Edition content creators on YouTube. It helps us all out. With that, have a nice day and adventure on.